Chapter 2. Random Thoughts from a Life Long Lived. When in February 1970 I began my untranquil tenure as a criminal court judge, it was not a career I could have anticipated or prepared for. There was nothing in my life that remotely suggested that I would ever have an active role in politics, nor did I ever have any ambition to be a judge. I was 50 years of age, a bit late to be coming to the bench, although not an unusual age for the few blacks who did manage to become judges. I had always been an adversary of the system, as opposed to one of its functionaries. I had some fairly heavy baggage of remembered experiences, including service in the United States Army during World War II. One of my mistakes was seeking to match logic against military attitudes and the impatience of the military mind with reason. Sent from New York to Camp Rucker, Alabama, I could not understand racial segregation in a democratic army that was fighting against Nazi and fascist racism. One experience in Alabama that resulted in a court-martial and punishment that could have been worse was a harsh lesson. Most of the black troops at Camp Rucker were in a quartermaster or service battalion. When a white artillery unit managed to set local woods on fire with its practice shots, the black unit was called out to fight the fire. I requested permission to see the company captain, as I had a right to do. We had had confrontations before. He demanded to know my business. I told him that under no circumstances could I help put out the fire. Livid, he asked if I was crazy. I told him that countless Negroes had been lynched on trees in Alabama, and that I hoped that all of the state's trees would burn down and perhaps spread to neighboring Confederate states. The captain, showing no patience for my knowledge of neighboring geography, yelled to the company's first sergeant to take me away. Accused of insubordination, I eventually stood trial. My socio-historical arguments were brushed aside. Many of us referred to the camp as Camp Mother Rucker. My experiences in Alabama had not prospered from my first day there. I had arrived with several other university students and graduates, including my track coach at Lincoln University. We were greeted by a Captain Hopke, an officer from Sakeston, Missouri, where a Negro man had been lynched in a particularly barbaric fashion. He asked each of us to recite names, rank, and serial numbers, just as they appeared on our service records. When the captain reached me, I said, "Bruce MCM Wright, private, parentheses colored, close parentheses." He was furious and said he was not going to have any smart-ass sons of bitches in his outfit. Worse was to come. Camp Rucker was in a dry county of the state, and each weekend soldiers with passes would rush off to Panama City, Florida, where alcohol was not prohibited. Before being dismissed for the weekend, however, there were always inspections of the troops conducted by a major. One Sunday, as the company stood at attention, the major swaggered before us and said, "I thought I told you boys to make your mess kit shine like a nigga's heel." My immediate dialogue with him resulted in extra duty and triggered furious efforts to be in touch with congressmen from New York and somehow get a transfer to the segregated Air Force, then training in Tuskegee Institute in another part of Alabama. Much later, I learned that none of my letters ever left Camp Rucker. Finally sent overseas, first to Scotland, then to Liverpool, and thereafter to Wales, I was assigned to a medical detachment, where I remained until Dwight D. Eisenhower addressed a message to, quote, the Negro troops. With more casualties than he had anticipated in the North African campaign, the general said that we might then volunteer for the combat infantry, where our white brothers had borne the brunt as though we had been slackers. I was a coward, certainly, but not a slacker. I volunteered along with a few thousand others. Overwhelmed by the response, those in charge imposed new intellectual and physical standards to weed out some, and ultimately about 3,000 were accepted to be distributed among selected infantry divisions. Assigned to the 1st Infantry Division's 26th Regiment with a few other blacks, I arrived at my company and we were greeted by a short, angry captain. His welcome was memorable. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when a nigger would wear the big red one." It was Alabama transported across the seas. The black presence in the division may have changed in the surface way of our presence, but not in white fundamental attitudes. When I was wounded in France, healed and ready to rejoin my company, a white sergeant called out the names of all of the other soldiers gathered near 2 trucks. "Listen up for your names," he said. "If you're white, stand over here. If you're colored, stand over there." And yet, all of us were going to the same division. When the war was over, the process of racial conditioning continued. Selected to be returned to the United States because of the points I had accumulated by reason of time overseas, I walked onto a naval vessel with others. I carried my duffel bag of souvenirs and a typewriter I had looted in Czechoslovakia, and wore all of my medals and decorations, including a combat infantryman's badge. A naval officer, staring at me, said to a fellow officer, "I didn't know niggers were fighting." A few steps along, I did a right about face and walked off the ship. I took a third-class car on a train bound for Paris, where I remained until caught and shipped back to the United States. In Paris, I looked up Leopold Sédar Senghor, then a classics professor in the Colonial University, the first sub-Saharan African to win a PhD degree in France. He was very much a black Frenchman. He and I had met shortly after the liberation of Paris, while my unit was on an 8-hour pass. I was introduced to him as a black American poet. Some of my poems had been published in Cardiff after D-Day and while I was then across the Channel. A former classmate at Lincoln had somewhat excessively described me as a published poet. Senghor, of course, was widely known as a great intellectual and poet. He later became a senator for Senegal, and after the independence of Senegal, he became the country's president. He looked after me and fed me during my stay in Paris. Eventually, he assigned Professor Louis Achille of Lyon to translate my poetry and to prepare it for a bilingual edition. The project never occurred, and it was only after my return to New York that Langston Hughes and I became friends, and he did much to help me publish some of my poetry in various quarterlies. Back in New York, I completed my law school studies and became an associate in the firm of Proskauer, Rose, Getz, and Mendelssohn, where there had never been a black associate. The Proskauer firm is more than 100 years old and enjoyed, as it does now, great prestige. It is what is known as a Jewish firm, and is doubtless a product of those not so distant days when discrimination among the Christian firms barred Jews from membership there. My experience there introduced me to a well-dressed world of carefully preened young intellectuals and starched respectability. Its corporate clients were light years distant from the plebeian harshness of crime. I was in the midst of exciting new experiences and learning from the inside things that had only been touched upon in law school. As the first black lawyer in that firm, I was, of course, a token. I formed lasting relationships with Edward Silver, Harold Levin, and Philip Haberman Jr. All three did much to aid my career. Silver risked his own career in the firm by nominating me for a partnership in 1968. I had left the firm long before that, when the managing partner, Bernard Lang, told me that I could stay as long as I wished, but that I would never become a partner. The firm's clients, he said, were not ready for a Negro partner. That was 1951. The year 1968, Silver said, was different, but it was different in a way that made it the same. At the time, I was general counsel to the Human Resources Administration of the City of New York. I was led to believe that the only thing standing in the way of my becoming a partner at Proskauer was the absence of one partner in Europe. As law partnerships are very much private clubs, nothing so radical as the election of a black partner could be consummated without the vote of all the partners. Nevertheless, I felt fairly comfortable. The absent partner had never revealed any animus against me when I was with the firm. Indeed, he had pretty much ignored me. I had had several lunches at the Cornell Club to meet various people then with the firm, and I had had conversations with Walter Mendelson, who is the senior partner. After the lapse of what seemed a long time, I began to ask how things were going. Silver seemed embarrassed and said little. Finally, Phil Haberman told me that one of his partners, Charles Looker, had said that Negroes were anti-Semitic, that they wanted black power, and that then was not the time to take a black partner. Silver said that one day he would try again, but I felt that he did not really mean it and was seeking to offer me a comfort of sorts. It was never to come to pass. However, the time that I had spent at the Proskauer firm was instructive. When, in 1951, I decided to leave that office, I was summoned to the office of Joseph M. Proskauer. I was in awe of him, not only because of his status in the firm, but because he had been a state Supreme Court justice and had served on its appellate division. Proskauer was a remarkably gifted man with a brilliant mind and no tolerance for mediocrity. He demanded to know why I was leaving and asked me if I had any clients. He then said that it was silly to try to start a practice without clients. He then called his secretary and asked her the name of the only client he had when he decided to be independent. He said he had been foolish enough to think he could earn a living with but a single client. At the same time she answered, he said, "Oh yes, it was that goddamn bank." He then proceeded to tell me how lucky I was and how things had changed since he was a youth. He began to reminisce about the past, suggesting that just a few years earlier, I would never have been fortunate enough to become a lawyer. He told me that his father had been a Confederate colonel and had been wounded by a Yankee ball that went through one of his cheeks and out the other. But my father, he added, never lost his cigar. All I could think of was what havoc must have been wrought to his father's teeth and gums. I thought that would be the end of my extraordinary audience. But the judge then recalled his boyhood in Mobile, Alabama. He said that if he was walking along a sidewalk and an approaching Negro did not step deferentially into the roadway or gutter, he had the right to knock him there with impunity. I wondered what would happen if a Negro woman did not defer. It was an eerie moment, as I thought how strange it felt to be in the presence of a man whose father had fought to preserve black slavery. My own experience with Jews and their involvement in civil rights struggles made it odd for me to remember that there had been Jewish Confederates. In law school, of course, there had been some passing reference to Benjamin Onsales, a leading text on the subject. Judah Benjamin had been the Jewish Secretary of State in the Confederacy. There were others as well who were ardent Southerners and who identified with the cause of the South during, before, and after the Civil War. History reveals that Morris J. Raphael, a Southern rabbi, sought to make certain that American Judaism worked to oppose abolition. He believed that slaveholding was no sin and that the Old Testament could be cited in support of that institution. On the other hand, there were Northern Jews who, with equal ardor, supported the Union cause. I had never associated Jews with slave owning, although there had been some who owned blacks, even as there had been a few Negro slave owners. As I sat with the judge, it was a rare and memorable confrontation with history for me. On the one or two other occasions when I had been in the same room with him, he had never spoken directly to me. On one, I was delivering some important papers to him at the Harmony Club, where he sat chatting with former Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia. He accepted the papers but never stopped talking with LaGuardia. It was my last sight of LaGuardia. He sat like a round Buddha, smoking with cigarette ashes strewn down his vest. Before excusing me and wishing me well, the judge autographed a pen and ink drawing of himself and gave it to me. It was thus that I joined three other young lawyers in a small office on Fifth Avenue at 43rd Street to begin that adventure known as private practice. The practice itself was uneventful because I had been associated with the Proskauer firm. I became known as a library lawyer and was subjected to some friendly jeers by various Harlem lawyers. They nevertheless came to me when they wanted a brief written or an appeal argued. It was a time when most of the black lawyers in Manhattan were clustered in offices at 209th West 125th Street. Several worked full-time for the post office and practiced only at those things that could be done in the office. The practical wisdom was that if a black lawyer had a negligence case that was worth a great deal of money, he would retain a white lawyer of counsel. After all, there were then no more than 4 black judges in the city at the time, and none of them was a Supreme Court justice. My early days at the bar saw my office do the same thing, and Emile Zola Berman was a favorite practitioner to whom our best negligence cases would be referred. The business of my firm took a rather quirky turn in 1952. One of my clients was Leonard Bates, who had been a great scholar-athlete at New York University during the days when its football team played interstate rivals. Whenever NYU played a team south of Pennsylvania, however, Bates was left behind so as not to offend the other team. It was ironic, since offending a football adversary was and is at the heart of the game. It was the kind of racism that famous educational institutions helped perpetuate by accepting it and being willing co-conspirators. One of the Bates brothers had married a woman from a well-known Boston family. She was one of several beneficiaries of 2 trust funds and had what is generally described as an independent income. She interested herself in the Baha'i faith and the spiritual unity of mankind. She took her 4 young daughters off to the Caribbean and then to Mexico City. Eventually, she committed suicide, and Bates had to go to Mexico City to bring the young children to New York. In representing Bates, who became the guardian of his brother's daughters, one of my duties had been to go to Mexico to see if I could discover the unmarked grave of the mother of the little girls. The girls themselves had been placed in a private school near Poughkeepsie in upstate New York. On one weekend, one of the young girls with other teenagers came to New York and visited a jazz club where Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers were performing in Greenwich Village. Blakey and the young girl were soon thereafter married, and as Blakey needed legal advice, I began doing legal work for him. Recognized as one of the two or three great jazz percussionists in the world, he was much in demand in jazz and recording circles, both in the United States and Europe and Japan. After years of classical violin study and being snobbish about Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and others, I began to marvel at the amazements of jazz, and traveled, as Blakey put it, over three-quarters of the world with the Jazz Messengers. Other than my adventures with that group and with other great performers written about elsewhere, my private practice of law was fairly ordinary. There were members of the Proskauer firm who would refer to me the problems of their maids and other black domestics. It was not a practice calculated to make me a wealthy man, for I had neither negligence nor criminal cases. However, I did enough business to have a great deal of time to myself and to travel with the musicians, as well as to survive the immersements of marriages that did not prosper. In 1967, members of Mayor John Lindsay's talent scouting team visited my office to recruit me for public service, something that I steadfastly rejected during the 1950s. I became general counsel to the Human Resources Administration and started along the road that was to lead, surprisingly, to a career on the bench and exposure to years of controversy and dispute. While I was not unaware of racism in American society, it was only after I came to the bench that the accumulation of historical data and common experience received a more anxious focus. What follows are some of the details of my thoughts about the judicial system and the racism of America that spills over into that aspect of existence that purports to epitomize impartiality, objectivity, and fairness. These, then, are reflections and musings, if you will, on a view of America based upon an entire life spent as a black male in a white world. Nearly 1/4 of that life has been spent as a judge. There are blacks in America who doubtless have some close emotional kinship with successful blacks in South Africa. It is not that American blacks join in violent suppression of other blacks, as do some of the black policemen and soldiers in South Africa. However, there are many so-called successful blacks in America whose notions of conservative existence reflect some of the same values as the most conservative whites. Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., Harlem's first black member of Congress, led demonstration in the area's main business street in an effort to compel F.W. Woolworth and other merchants to hire blacks. The people who joined such public and sometimes raucous demonstrations were not those who imagined that they were the cream of black society. They were the urban peasants who heard in Powell's voice a dramatization of their innermost thoughts and fearful longings. The bane of black progress in America has been the burden of imagined respectability. But it is precisely the respectability of the white majority that has resisted change in racial and racist attitudes. Blacks who claim respectability and allow that mirage to keep them quiet and from being actors in the necessary drama needed to change an oppressive society are instruments of continued oppression. And yet, remarkably, there is always some joy to be found in the black American circumstance. It is a perishable joy, to be sure. In its isolation, it is given occasional respiration that is as artificial as the dark imitation of American life. Those who bear the scarred beauty of blackness treasure the surprise of small comforts. We are dreamers who confront visions and nurture illusions and religion. In many ways, blacks are a people without a country, and at the same time, quintessential Americans, second only to the Indians in our miscegenated authenticity. Except for color, the only genetic linkage owned by blacks is with America. And rising from the rich chorus of black music and song, with its joy and its melancholy, is the exquisite sharpness and ironical bite of the black poet, County Cullen. In one of his poems, he rebukes God for making a poet black and bidding him to sing. While many reject the term Negro and prefer black or Afro American, few blacks enjoy the luxury of a sturdy bridge to the past. White immigrants celebrate their voluntary exodus from Europe to America, but blacks were never a part of that steerage influx that remembers Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty with tearful emotion. It is virtually impossible for blacks to look homeward except with nostalgia for a place they have never been. The critical element of kinship is painfully missing. While the descendants of white immigrants can return to Europe to visit ancestral villages and relatives, it is difficult to conceive of black Americans dashing off to Africa to visit the old tribe or root families. We have only wonderment for the historical divorce from what we never knew. We cling to America in a pathetic kind of urgency and with the desperation of those without national options. Black slaves, severed from their tribal sires, became involuntary students of biblical justification for their American condition. As Anna Arnold Hedgeman reminds us in her book, The Gift of Chaos, there was a time when Africans were the only immigrants to this country who came without tickets of passage, without visas, and without passports, and with no sense of direction. Blacks, in their bondage, became an expatriate census, badgered exiles in a world of aliens and citizens without a country. Visionaries and illusionists, their black images of desire fed upon themselves. Public expression of such things invites contempt from both whites and those Afro-Saxons who believe that bitterness is a lack of that gratitude that blacks should feel for America's blessings. The National Lawyers Guild was founded by lawyers who were dissatisfied with the exclusionary establishment. They regarded the American Bar Association as a symbol of Toryism. The Guild has fought for racial equality throughout the years. Its most successful members, however, have shown little or no interest in having blacks join their firms. At a meeting of the Guild to honor one of its founders, Hope Stevens, the black guest speaker, publicly mentioned the problem. He reminded the gathering of liberals and left-of-center lawyers and their guest that their proud liberalism and heroic fealty to the civil rights movement had not gone so far as to welcome black lawyers to their law firms. His remarks were received with the stunned silence and embarrassment of a donor of alms who sees the beneficiary of his generosity curse the giver and his gift. It was as though a profane clamor had trespassed in the temple. The brief and hesitant applause that followed was a mere Pavlovian response of an audience programmed to clap at the end of any speech. No one stood up to challenge Stevens. The membership obviously had no desire for public self examination or for those dedicatory pledges that spring with guilt. The audience was plainly embarrassed. It was a tribute to the candor of their inbred dedication to the American way of life that none made any false promises to do better. The largely Jewish audience seemed more content to believe that most of them were minorities and that regarding circumstance had not stopped their own progress, and that therefore blacks should not whine or whimper but do exactly as they had done. Such an angry reaction ignored the fact that Jews, no matter what else Christian America may think of them, have protective coloration, the most blessed of American physical characteristics. It was simply that the audience was humiliated for a moment by the harshness of the truth to which its members had contributed. It was almost as though Stevens had undraped an indecent statue in the presence of prudes who did not realize that they were the sculptors. Whites, even liberal whites, were weaned on racism. They live and breathe the superiority of options, choices, and opportunities that are available to those who wear the white skin. When most white students study sociology, it is little more than an academic subject to be passed. The black victims of that social science may be deplored briefly, but they are not to be associated with, understood, or invited to join clubs and fraternities. When they graduate into professional schools and careers, whites carry these exclusions into their professions. Law schools of today appear to believe in more and more practical clinical programs. Their students are now placed with judges and administrators of private and government affairs. Few schools, however, place their students in black slum areas, where they can touch, taste, and experience life in living color, or at least try to do so. I say try because I believe, with James Baldwin, that perhaps no white will ever be able to feel the debasement reserved for dark skin in America until some white is compelled by general circumstance to write a song such as the Negro Spiritual. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. White liberals are naturally a failure if their liberalism is supposed to stand for anything meaningful to blacks. It is as though they have a special definition for blacks, which has built-in limitations. It reaches a point at which it satisfies its own restrictive meaning, and after that, the metamorphosis allows each liberal to deteriorate into a white John Average. Along with blacks, then, they recognize that majority rule must carry the day, and that blacks in a white society are at the mercy of those who outnumber them. As with the Jews, who should be their natural allies in a Christian country of potential jeopardy, the blacks are the most endangered of all endangered species. It is clear that many blacks believe that Jews should be their allies. Those who cherish such a fugitive concept are mistaken. In America, Jews have found the flawed but almost perfect socio-political ecology for their development and prosperity. They are accepted as white, the historical precondition for American success. In New York, at least, since the 1930s, Jews have dominated the legal profession by numbers alone. Accepted by both the American Bar Association and the Association of the Bar of the City of New York long before blacks, many have risen to positions of preeminence in the profession. One of my Jewish friends, now a senior managing partner in a prestigious and wealthy law firm, once said to me with a pleased smile, "Well, Bruce, the Jews are now deans of the four most important law schools in the country." He was speaking proudly of Harvard, Yale, Cornell, and Columbia. He could see no danger in that success and ridiculed my expressed fear that society could turn against the Jews. He refused to believe that in America the Jews could ever join the blacks as an endangered species. It made no difference to him that the Nazis were Christians, both Protestants and Catholics, as were the overwhelming numbers of slave owners in America. With so numerous a census of Jewish lawyers, from among whom so many judges are selected, one might expect that the New York bench would be one of the most liberal in the world. It might be expected that Jewish judges and lawyers, aware of who had been the chief victims of Nazi judges, lawyers, and law, would be avid guardians of the law to make certain that it never faltered in its high purpose of even-handed libertarianism. There would be a certain degree of self-interested morality in assuring equality to the blacks, so that nothing sinister could befall the Jews. I cherished this hapless vision for many years. When I was practicing law, I assumed that the only way to win a fair hearing for my black clients was to appear before a Jewish judge. I ridiculed those who changed their religion from Christian to Muslim, suggesting that it made more sense to become a Jew. Whenever any case of mine came before an Irish Catholic judge, or the one or two Protestant judges then sitting, I would not hesitate to adjourn it, in the hope of coming before two of the Jewish judges. My preference it was to argue before either Henry Clay Greenberg or Samuel Hofstadter. Their reputations were a guarantee that close attention would be paid to the merits without regard to the race of the lawyer of the client. In my view, however, both made typical white American mistakes in cases that were disputes involving acute issues of pure racism. In a suit against the Hotel Pierre for the Urban League Guild, there had been victory at the trial level. On appeal before the appellate term of the Supreme Court, Hofstadter posed questions that revealed how distant was his understanding of discrimination resting solely upon race. Mrs. Molly Moon was the tireless head of the guild, a fundraising arm of the league. She had arranged by telephone for the guild's annual summer fundraising party to be held on the Hotel Pierre's roof garden, and she appeared in person to sign the contract. The banquet manager, obviously taken aback when he saw that she was a black woman, refused to deal with her. He denied that he had spoken to her by telephone or that the date and alternative date discussed had ever been available. Because the guild is composed of blacks and whites, Hofstadter said that the civil rights law was not meant to cover such situations. He said that Mrs. Moon was the agent of an interracial principle and could have no relief. I said to him, "Your Honor, assume that you, a white person, asked me, a Negro, to get a container of coffee for you. I go to the restaurant and ask for the coffee. The counterman says to me, 'Bruce, you know we don't serve colored people here.' I reply, 'But this is for Judge Hofstadter, not me.' Under those circumstances, do you mean to suggest that there is no discrimination against me because of my color? Judge Hofstetter was so discomfited that he spun around in his swivel chair and said, "Come now, Mr. Wright. When one Negro is discriminated against, you want to give every Negro in the country a cause of action." I replied somewhat testily that that might not be a bad idea. In an unprecedented reaction by the appellate term audience, there was brief and surprising applause. Later in my career, one of the respected judges of the civil court requested that I write an opinion for him in another hotel discrimination case. I did so, taking the opportunity to attack the reasoning in the Molly Moon case and making it clear that the civil rights law should also cover whites who were discriminated against because of color. In the latter case, a white wife and a black husband had been refused accommodations because, as the hotel manager said, mixed couples always fight. In the area of criminal law, it is difficult to imagine more than a few Jewish judges before whom a black defendant might appear in the hope not of favoritism but simply of a fair and unbiased hearing into which innate racism would not intrude. One of the problems is that white judges fail to perceive a color problem that lies deep within themselves and is the grotesque product of their daily lives from the time they are born. Americans are victims of a problem that has mistakenly been characterized as the Negro problem, but is really a white one, deeply rooted in traditional racism. One of the oddities in American life, both ironic and paradoxical, is that blacks, who were once deprived of education deliberately and then given inferior instruction, understand perfectly the folly and senselessness of color discrimination, yet whites seem to be increasingly dense on the subject. My Jewish friends, for example, utterly fail to understand the fallacious opposition to what they call racial quotas. They prefer to recall that Jews themselves were victims of quotas, especially at the so-called Ivy League universities and at U.S. medical schools. But they forget that they made up those quotas at prestigious schools to which blacks had no entry at all. They also neglect to comprehend a striking distinction between the restrictive quotas imposed on them in the past, and probably in the present in some cases, and those devised by some courts to open and expand opportunities for blacks. There is a vast difference between quotas that limit and those that expand, in order, as the argument goes, to redress past discriminations, which are not really past at all. The plight of Jews and blacks should be seen as more similar than different. Although the Jews fought against discriminatory quotas, they accepted them by enrolling whenever they could. The blacks accepting quotas of expansion also are struggling to come from behind and in greater numbers. They also want a system of merit, but they want it to start in the earliest grade school years of instruction, so that all black neighborhood schools do not become the neglected academic orphans of the system. The Christian Society's imposition of Jewish quotas should have long ago conveyed the ominous message of America's blood-based caste system. Despite what happened in Nazi Germany, even in the post-war period in America, Many universities in this country still had Jewish quotas. When John Sloan Dickey was the president of Dartmouth College, he felt so secure in the tradition of Christian hegemony that he could candidly announce that, yes, Dartmouth did have quotas for Jewish students, and that these quotas were for the benefit of the Jews. There would be less discrimination if there were smaller numbers of such students on campus. For an educator to have such a view smacks of a grave gap in his education. Christian racists must be amused to see the blacks and Jews pitted against each other. Nearly all of the most powerful Jewish organizations brought their considerable resources together to oppose black aspirations for entry into professional and graduate schools, as well as for new opportunities in industry. The industrial disputes found the Jewish ideologues in a particularly offensive posture because they well knew of the oppressive cooperation between unions and management through the years to deprive blacks of chances for advancement. They should have known how demeaning it is to blacks to be compelled to fight for quotas. The sociological warfare had sometimes escalated into street riots for the sparse improvements in life that eventually were won. That dark struggle is not aided by those who scream about quotas, preferential treatment, and reverse discrimination. No one seems to understand that inherent in the term reverse discrimination is the discrimination that blacks have sought to reverse since the bias imposed by the Constitution. Jews should remember that the Constitution never referred to them as 3/5 of a person, nor did it speak of their importation. Blacks may be able to hate, to detest, to dislike, and to express bitter opinions, but seldom are they in positions to discriminate. That is, to deprive some other person of a merited advantage because of race, color, national origin, or religion. A recent letter to the New York Times, signed by one Miro M. Todorovich, illustrates how white immigrants often seek to outdo Native Americans in committing fouls in the skin game. With an apparently straight face, Todorovich seeks to defend Mayor Edward Koch's opposition to the 10% set aside for minority contracts as upheld by the United States Supreme Court. The letter writer concludes his paean of praise for Koch by admonishing the Congressional Black Caucus to, quote, ponder the wisdom of seeking reparations at the expense of enterprises that built this nation with hard work and the spirit of competition, end quote. Such crass and racist ignorance of history is unforgivable in one who describes himself as a professor at a community college. He ignores the disgraceful panorama of black slavery and the fact that those slaves also built this nation with hard work. Theories of competition were ruled out because they could only have advanced the slaves and would have involved no reparations, such as were paid to the Jewish survivors of the Nazi Holocaust, and are being sought by the Japanese survivors of America's World War II concentration camps, and by dispossessed Indians, victims of patriotic grand larceny of their geography by pious white settlers. I dare say Todorovich might oppose reparations payable to those blacks who were able to prove their genetic kinship with unpaid slaves.